Welcome to the Working Mama podcast, a show that provides real-world tips, tricks, and advice to all working mamas on how they can have a career, family, and hopefully one day break the glass ceiling. Hey there, Mama. Welcome back to another episode of the Working Mama podcast. Well, I have an absolutely amazing episode for you today. One of the things, if you've listened for a while, I love talking about and breaking down some of the societal norms and the social constructs, particularly relating to gender equality and the shared labour between both mothers and fathers in a relationship. And today I have not one, but two amazing guests that have come on to talk about this topic together. And it's Coleen MacKinnon and Rob Sturrock. They are both experts in their field and have real world experience and so many hints, tips and gold that we talk about. And I know between the three of us, we could probably have talked about this for such a lot longer. But yes, it is a slightly longer episode than what we usually do. But I have to say, please just listen to it if it's over a few different time gaps. It's well worth it. And I'd also suggest, if you're a female or a mum listening to this, get your husband to listen to it as well, because Rob has a real good father's perspective. And I think, if you probably heard me talk about this before, but the mental load and gender equality, I believe, actually starts in the home. So the more that we can actually get that shared labour happening at home, it will certainly then have a flow-on effect into organisations. And we talk about this a little bit more. So without further ado, let's get into it. Just quickly, as always, I would love if you could leave a rating or review on Apple Podcasts and also share this episode with anyone else, particularly your husband or, a male friend that might be interested or, learn something and get some good takeaways from this episode. Okay, let's get into it. Cheers. Welcome to the Working Mama podcast. Today, I have not but one, but two very special guests with me, Coleen and Rob. So I'm just going to kick it straight off and I will start with Coleen. Would you like to introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks very much, Karina. And it's really lovely to be here. I'm the principal and founder of Inclusivity Quotient, which is a consulting firm specializing in engaging men in gender equality. That's my day job. Beyond that, I would add social justice advocate, doing what I can to advance the rights of marginalized groups, such as those who identify as LGBT, Indigenous, or asylum seekers. And finally, and this probably should come first, I'm the mom of two tenacious Gen Zs and a partner to my very patient and progressive husband who carries more than 50% of the load.
Oh, I can't wait to get into it. And Rob, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Karina. Thanks for having me here today. So for your listeners, my name's Rob Sturrock. So I would call myself a dadvocate or an advocate for fatherhood. Absolutely not an expert on the topic. I'm still learning and failing as much as anyone else. So I've got two young children. My daughter's actually going to turn 7 in a couple of weeks. She's in year 1, which I can't believe on its own. And I've got a little boy who's 4.5. So I've got a regular pay job that I do in the not-for-profit sector, which is 4 days a week. And then I have 1 day with my children and try and be as active and involved with the kids while they're young as I possibly can. And kind of to Coleen's point, I've got also a very patient and supportive partner in Julia, and we try and share the load as equally as we can and make sure that the balls that we do drop are the rubber ones and not the glass ones.
Yeah. I was only just actually released a podcast this week and then she gave the analogy around the rubber and the glass balls. So yeah, it's certainly, I really love it. It's a good analogy. So today we're going to talk about gender equality and even gender inequity around, definitely parents, but also then understanding that as well from the father's lens, because we know that we need all parties to come together. We know that social, gender equality and reducing the gender pay gap isn't a female topic, as what some may lead to believe, that it's actually a society topic. And so gender inequality, as what we talk about, is literally undoing hundreds of years of patriarchal, cultural, and systemic mindsets built into our social construct. What do both of you think are some of those gender norms that have contributed to this inequality? And what are some of those systemic barriers creating gender diversity? And where does it all begin? And I know this is a very heavy and loaded question to begin with. Who wants to kick it off?
Coleen, do you want to have first crack at it?
Sure, I'm happy to go. And look, before we get into the norms that contribute to gender inequality, I think it's really important to unpack the source so that we can move towards interventions that will prevent these inequities in the first place that these norms create. Kind of like a mechanic, if we take our car to the garage, we don't want him to remove the sound for 5 minutes. We want him to get to the source under the hood. So, if we think of our own upbringings and, whether, regardless of our age, really, most of us grew up with a full-time working dad and a part-time working or stay-at-home mom, in part due to one of the least generous and highly gendered parental leave schemes and limited access to affordable childcare. Now, that's contributed to our global ranking of 5th highest in the world, the rate of women working part-time, and a much more entrenched male breadwinner, female carer culture. And we know that will slowly change. There are new reforms. But at the minute, we still have a generation of little boys and little girls growing up where dads work full-time and mums work part-time, with few exceptions, Rob and his family being one of them. But if you think about the messages we absorb from this very early age around the role of boys and girls, men and women, despite advances, and Karina, you've got young children, most of the books, films, and video games targeted to toddlers through to teenagers still have a boy as the lead or hero and a girl in a supporting role. In my work with men in corporate Australia, we look at the cover of Boys versus Girls magazines. The headlines in the girls magazine, just to pick one: Fall Fashion You'll Love, My Dream Hair, Wake Up Pretty. Boys magazine, you have these images of various types of careers, from fighter pilot to chef to fire engine driver, whatever, fireman, firewoman. The point being that these are all about exploring your future. You can be anything you want to be. It's all aspirational, with the girls being relational, how to be a good best friend, or what matters is how you look. There's, the great line that comes back to is, girls are ornamental, boys are instrumental. And that hasn't changed a whole lot. But what it means is, by the age of 6, girls begin to doubt their ability relative to boys. And by adolescence, they begin to lose interest in STEM subjects and careers. Now, these are the jobs of the future. And if we don't have more women in these roles, we're not going to progress, we're going to regress. Yeah. And this doesn't improve with age, these influences. 2/3 of film critics and book reviewers in both the US and the UK are men. And they're more likely to recommend films and books, regardless of the genre, with a male lead. If we look here at home in analysis of mainstream media, women are quoted much less frequently than men, and male journalists are less likely to quote women in their stories. So it leads to what Marianne Sieghart refers to as this authority gap, the underrepresentation and the undervaluing of women's perspectives, as well as this confidence gap amongst some women and an overconfidence amongst men. And I am getting to what's the impact going to be. But, this appears everywhere, in our workplaces, in the media, until recently in our parliament, men occupying the majority of leadership roles. And so how do these things play out? The assumption that women are no longer interested in careers once they start a family. And by extension, that they'll be less committed to their job and less likely to be interested in leadership positions than their male counterparts. The way we still raise boys and girls to a certain extent, boys to take risks and be adventurous, girls to be compliant and conciliatory, to be nice, results in men being seen as leaders, assertive, decisive, women as good team members, collaborative, conciliatory, but this impacts, of course, promotion decisions. And the stereotype that persists around women as nice versus agentic impacts performance evaluations. Assertive doesn't fit the feminine norm. And finally, with regard to this scant parental leave and the reforms underway, there is one area of concern. We've just lumped 18 weeks primary care and 2 weeks secondary. We removed that, what's become a gender nomination, to 20 weeks, which is still very inadequate compared to the 52-week average of the OECD. But also we have no designated father portion. And so the risk is what we're going to have now is women taking 20 weeks and men taking none. So those are some of the things that I think they're the source, but also the result of that source.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's certainly very interesting. And I know even as a mother with 2 young boys, it's actually interesting to see you talk about then the female role model in a movie. My son went through an obsession with Elsa, and it's amazing the Elsa role model. He even had an outfit. He wore Elsa to his book week last year as a 4-year-old. Very cute. But I had a few comments saying, "You've let a boy wear a dress to book week," and I was like, "Why not?"
Yeah.
Right.
And it's also about unpacking and changing those stereotypes. So as what you're saying about those social constructs. But I just sat here nodding of when you're saying about the magazine headlines, those authority gaps, more women in STEM. We know these things as well. And it's sad that I studied STEM when I was at university and not a whole lot's changed. Very small parts. I heard a stat recently that women in engineering has gone up from 12 to 16%. 75% of those 16% of women are educated overseas.
Wow. Yeah. Another interesting stat. We have 16% here, but in North America, it's 21% of women graduating engineering. And in some Muslim majority countries, it's up to 45%. So we know there's something culturally that we need to address as well.
And Rob, how about yourself? What are you seeing about where some of those, and what is your experience as well from those gender norms?
Yeah, well, look, to back up what Coleen was explaining, the patriarchy runs deep, and it runs deep in this country, permeates our culture, our mindsets, and our institutions. And, historically, Australia has what I think we can shorthand call a very blokey culture. It has focused on a very hyper-masculine, narrow sort of definition of masculinity as well. So, I agree completely with everything Coleen said. It's a great, broad brush of the landscape. I think the additional challenge for men is that, a lot of what we have set up in terms of culture and systems, and Coleen talked about paid parental leave, and even our parliamentary institutions and our corporate institutions, they're set up for men, and they're set up for men to be sort of extroverted, dominant, controlling, holding all the space, taking charge of decisions, being stoic and fearless and showing no emotion or regret or doubt. It's that sort of culture that we're really trying to penetrate and unravel and unlock. So to back up what Coleen was talking about, if you're a man that really wants to be kind of open and sensitive and vulnerable and wants to wear their heart on their sleeve and is really focused on being a nurturing, loving parent and wanting to dote on their children, it can feel hard from a cultural and from a systems perspective. You might not feel comfortable kind of being open about how much you love your kids and all the little goofy things you do with them. And it may be difficult for you to sort of front up to work and ask for a big chunk of parental leave or talk about it with your coworkers. So, the way that masculinity and men, to Coleen's point, have kind of dominated all our spaces, it's also crowded out a lot of different types of masculinity as well. And obviously we've got a big, long-standing problem with the types of masculinity in this country and how we create something more healthy. So, parenthood and fatherhood and men stepping up to do more of the caring is, to me, it's almost the first line of attack, really. It's where we can really, from our homes through to our communities, schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces, really start to buck some of these gender norms and these stereotypes and see men, being committed and explicit about wanting to be caring parents and loving parents, helping share the load with their partners, being the one that's there at the school doing not just the pickups and the drop-offs, but library duty, reading duty, canteen duty, talking about taking parental leave and encouraging others in the workplace. So, we can have these champions at different parts of our society. And I really do think that, these individuals, if they're sort of bucking the norms and sort of charting a new path, they can really have a butterfly effect across our community. And we can really start to see our masculinity change. We can see men stepping out of the workforce. And then hopefully we're seeing men kind of share that space way better with women and others in the community, and not kind of holding on to it the way they did in the 20th century.
Yeah, certainly. And as what Coleen said about those role models with young kids, the more that our kids, and I'm sure like Rob, you spending a day a week with your children and working 4 days a week, can actually then have that ripple effect, because then, as what we're saying, we're trying to change, really young kids' perceptions about what is the role of a mother and what is the role of a father as well. And I know from a personal experience, my husband is like, no, we've agreed, and he's very committed to, we do share the load quite well. Yes, he works 5 days a week, but he's pretty much out the door at 5 o'clock, so we can be at home for dinner, and we have it together as a family, and we'll share the load with who's cooking and things like that. So I'm really respectful for him, and he's willing to make some sacrifices as well. Just about, he goes, no, we've got 2 young kids. I want to be there. I think it's also a learning off his own father of getting home at 8, 9 o'clock late at night. And he goes, I don't want that.
Yeah.
Well, if that, it's kind of the around that, do you work to live or do you live to work kind of
absolutely.
approach.
And if I can add on to what you were saying, Karina, talking about your husband looking at his dad, it's been exactly the same with my father. My father his dominant part of his working life was 70s, 80s, and 90s. And he was the classic male breadwinner. He worked his guts out. He traveled a lot. He had long hours, high pressure job, because that was what it was expected of him. And I got used to a dad that was there and loving and present predominantly on the weekends or after work when he was tired, but then away a lot, in Canberra a lot for work, overseas for work. And that's what it was like. And I guess, it was no fault of his own. He was trying to provide the best standard of living he could for his family. And he was in a career that demanded that of him. But I certainly looked at that as I got to the age of having kids, and was like, well, I don't want to be that absent. I want to try and have more control over my presence in my kid's life and try to shape my career accordingly, really.
Coleen, I remember when we were speaking before in preparation for this podcast, you said that you, in some of the men's circles that you've run, the older men that have got grandkids have actually reflected on this, of just about what Rob's just saying about how they actually want to be there more for their grandkids.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, I think it's the millennial dads who are driving the change, like Rob and your husband, Karina. But in the circles that we do run, it's intergenerational. So we have dads, young dads, and we have grandfathers. And what's interesting is, as the young dads are explaining how much they want to be active, much more active in their family's life and their children's lives, the older gentlemen are sitting there sort of reflecting, not saying a lot. But after some time, they're like, you know what? These things weren't available to me when my kids were little. There was no flex work. There was no shared parental leave. But I have grandchildren now, or I have aging parents. I want to work flexibly so I can help my children with their children, help, bring my grandkids to school, or bring my aging parents to their medical appointments. So for me, it really is around engaging men across the board to help overcome what has been generations, if not centuries, of these gendered norms that are holding everyone back.
So what are some other ways that people, so if they're coming up against barriers, or obviously we've just talked quite a lot about those role models, but that also requires confidence and also men to actually stand up. And sometimes they may be seeing that next promotion and go, oh, I might just be quiet just in case. And even probably the same thing as well for some women of, oh, look, I might not sit back. My husband might be getting a promotion and things like that. So obviously turning the tide for this starts at a pretty young age, even probably before birth. I know when we were pregnant with our first son, we didn't tell anyone what the gender was, because we didn't want a whole wardrobe of of blue clothes. Instead, we got grey, which was fine. I was quite happy with that. Because I didn't want him to be stereotyped from just such a young age of, oh, you got a boy and there you go. So I guess it's not a silver bullet with these things either, and it's taking them in probably scenario and isolation as well.
Yeah. I think we have to look at this as a life cycle approach, and who do we need to bring in? And so, just as you said, when you're son had the Elsa costume on, you had parents saying, you really let him wear this? And so it has to start with parents. And if parents understood the damage that these norms cause for both boys and girls, they'd obviously be very willing to come on board. But we don't do a lot around that. It's hard to reach parents. We reach parents in schools, but kids are already 5 years old by that time. It's the same thing, if we think about it, life cycle, we have to reach teachers. We have to ensure that teachers are not reinforcing these gendered norms. I have a daughter who was very good at maths and sciences, but she said, my science teacher and my math teacher spoke to the boys in the class, taught to the boys in the class, ignored the girls. Again, this bias around that is, has been debunked by many incredible academics like Gina Rippon in the UK or Cordelia Fine here in Australia. There are more differences within our sexes than there are across sexes. And so it's about, okay, it's time to move past that. But if we don't take it as a whole of system or a life cycle approach, we're not going to reach all of these influencers along the way. The media is another example. The media, we've got to hold the media to account. In the UK, they introduced legislation where you can no longer show men and women in stereotypical roles. Unilever changed its policy when it was pointed out that only 2% of its advertising showed women in professional roles.
Wow.
And
I guess it's not until you call these things out to people go, oh, that really isn't good either.
Exactly. Yeah. And what's the impact?
Yeah. And obviously, Rob, you're, as you said, a dadvocate. How is your experience going through this and, coming up across some of these, to change the tide, really?
Yeah. Look, it's certainly been a fascinating journey. It's had its peaks and its troughs. I think building on what we were talking about before, I guess my real starting point is for any dads or men that might be listening. Like, I spent most of my adult life until my mid-30s being completely apathetic, if not terrified of children. I thought, I don't want kids. I don't like them. I don't have anything to do with them. The thought of having kids absolutely terrified me. So if younger me could see me here sort of waxing lyrical about fatherhood and the joys of it and trying to encourage other men, that he'd be mystified. So I say that, like, any man can step up and be a fantastic parent. You don't need to have had a wealth of skills or experience or babysitting or whatever. So I guess when we're approaching having our first child, I was, thinking about the lessons in it, thinking about everything we've already talked about, and thinking, okay, well, I want to be really active. I want to balance family and work. I want to be there for my child. And so Julia, my wife, and I are really having a conversation about how do we best do that. So I guess the first point really is you try and have a very clear and open line of communication with your partner and come to an agreement about, okay, how do we want to approach parenting? It's all plans need changing, but to at least, I think, get on the same page about how are you going to share the load, what's important to you as a family, and every family is a bit different, and what are we going to do in terms of juggling work and career? And to Colleen's very first point about sort of gender norms and biases, I remember the very first conversation I had with Julia when we were talking about, okay, who's going to do the lion's share of the work? And we were going in trying to be as equal as possible. Our first draft solution was that I would work full time and Julia would work 3 days. And we both thought, okay, great. And then we took a moment and thought, wait a minute, if we want to be equal, why am I working more than you? Why does my career matter more than you? But even with the most, like, the best intent, we still fell back into those norms very quickly. So I think the first part is a clear, honest communication about, about how you can support each other through parenting. And I think partly for dads, and I've been reflecting on this for a while, because I've been sort of in this fatherhood space for doing the advocacy for about 5-6 years now. And I'd be really interested in both your thoughts, Coleen and Karina, is I don't think men are used to fighting for things that they want as much in these sort of spaces. I mean, we have a long history of, women's rights movement in Australia and across the world. Things like men, I don't think we're accustomed to what it takes, the long-term advocacy to bring about this sort of systemic change. I think we, and, I'm, middle-class white male, we're kind of used to having everything handed to us on a silver platter and having a set of cultures and institutions built for us. And this is one where there isn't a silver bullet. You're absolutely right. It's going to take some some men sticking their necks out, saying, this is what matters to me. It matters to me to be a father. It matters to me having flexible work and job sharing or looking for part-time work, and pushing the case up inside their workplaces, their communities, and, and amongst their social networks. And I think it's part of the reality. I've been reflecting on it for a while, is I think men just have to sort of stump up and sort of fight for it as well. And as you were both saying, gender equality is not a woman's issue. It's a whole of community, whole of society issue. And I think this is one where we just need men to not only be role models, but to be champions for this case, and for pushing for equal parenting. I think sometimes in my journey, with both my kids, I took extended parental leave for each of them. I took a few weeks off at their birth. I was really trying to be as hands-on as possible. I got pretty good support from both my workplaces to do that, but sometimes it was a bit lonely and a bit isolating, and you are sticking your neck out and you are the only dad doing it. And I remember my first experience of going back to work after having extended parental leave, and I went back. So it was the first time I was working part-time, and looking back, I had a unrealistic and a naive impression of what that would entail in terms of workload and how to juggle things in the office, and I hadn't even thought about really what happens when the kids get sick, or I get sick and they bring home a daycare bug, and suddenly my 4-day week becomes a 1-day week or a 2-day week. And that was incredibly stressful. It was a big strain on my mental health at the time. And so I think part of it too is trying to go in with eyes wide open, that it's joyous. Like, being with your kids and being active is so fleeting when they're young, and it's so precious, and you don't want to regret it, to Colleen's point. But you do need to go in with eyes wide open, that there's going to be challenges. It's going to be exhausting, but it's going to be worth it. So I think, it is leadership, it's role models. And I think probably the last point, we can talk about systems as well, but I think it's trying to find solidarity where you can, amongst mums and dads and colleagues and friends, or your father, or, your grandparents, and just to find that support network where you can, express your frustrations or your joys and test ideas, and just have that network around you to help you through. And I think particularly for dads, that's really important, because being maybe the dad in the playground in the middle of the week can feel a bit lonely. You can feel like a bit of a novelty, but yeah, stick with it, because it's going to be worth it.
So well said, Rob. I know my sister and my brother-in-law both have gone 4 days a week each, so they could actually then have that time with their children. And I remember when my brother-in-law said he's only going to go but he's going to go back 4 days a week. And I remember my parents' response. It was, oh no, what about his career? What's going to happen? But it wasn't, my sister wasn't put in the same context. And I'm thinking, my sister's probably a little bit more career orientated than what he is. And it was interesting, the different perceptions on oh no, he's not working 5 days a week. And then, but it's just put out there, but it was such a good way to do it. But as you said, sticking your neck out. Did you get any negative feedback from, many people of when you were sticking your neck out?
A little bit. Yeah. Look, it was, I should say, it was mostly supportive. I think there probably were some curious looks, and it was absolutely, to your point, Karina, I got asked questions about taking leave that Julia never got asked. And let's be honest, she took 10 months of maternity leave twice. I took 3 months twice. So she did way more than me, but there was no questions about what would do for her career, and what about her boss, and would you get bored at home? Like, I was the one that got those questions, not her. I think the first time round, when I was working part-time for the first time, I think it did cause some frustrations at work, in particular, because I was trying to draw some pretty clear boundaries around when I was and was not available, and when I could and could not do travel. And I think, to be absolutely fair, it was a small organization. I don't think any of us, boss or me, any of us had really thought through the ramifications. But that was a bit tough. And it had a really big impact on my mental health in a very short period of time. I went from thinking I was juggling the balls pretty well on the whole to feeling I was failing pretty spectacularly at both. And that was really hard. And I think there's been some fantastic research done on the years around, the work conflict amongst dads. And I think at that point I had a very high work conflict stress going on in my life. I think there has been some progress, I think, in terms of culture and policies available and men taking leave in the last, maybe say 2 to 3 years in particular. I think COVID's had a bit to do with that. So I feel like there is a broader acceptance when you're talking about working part-time and taking I call it my daddy day at work. No one blinks an eye. And to be honest, no one's really blinked an eye for several years now. So I think that's fantastic. But I think for men, sometimes you can go into taking parental leave or being an active parent and kind of doubting your own skills. Am I really going to be good at this? Am I going to be as good as my wife? And then if you get some of that negative feedback from managers or colleagues, I think it can really feed on you and it can be corrosive. And, I think for men, that you've got to try and have a sense of self-belief. And, what I continue to remind myself is parenting is like any other skill, right? It's the on-the-job training is probably the most valuable thing of the lot. And I say that as someone who's written a book about fatherhood, but I'd say doing more is better than reading. And I think that's where the confidence comes from dads. And look, I always encourage dads to take the long-term view. And that's back to what, Coleen was talking about with working with, older men in the boardroom is, what am I now? 42. Let's be honest, probably working for another 30, 35 years at least. There's oodles of time to be involved in work and travel and conferences and all the rest. My kids are now 4 and 7. They've got a couple more years, then they're both in school and they're both going to be tweens and all the rest of it. So, try and think of a long-term too. You've got lots of time to play catch up at work if you're working a little bit less, and but you're only going to have these precious few years when your kids are young, and to Colleen's point, you've got they're very impressionable. They're little sponges absorbing everything you're doing and not doing, and saying and not saying. So make the most of it and try and be there, even if it leads to a little bit of discomfort in the short term.
Yeah, isn't it that they say the first 7 years are the most impressionable, and essentially then we spend the rest of our lives trying to undo some of those things that we've learned in that first 7 years. So
yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that, Coleen?
Yeah, look, you've made some really good points, Rob. I'll start with the last one, which is this men not feeling as skilled, or some men still thinking that this is just an instinctual thing, maternal instinct. One of the reasons why we absolutely need to have a portion of parental leave designated to men, and particularly the first 4 weeks, is because we know that's when the habits and the patterns are established. Women go into this blind as well. Julia would have been the same. How do I look after an infant? We don't have practice, right?
There's no guidebook.
There's no guidebook. And it is more about doing than reading after the fact. But so really addressing this issue of the structural barrier, which in this country we are lagging. And, my nephew, he and his partner just had a child last year in Canada, and they introduced shared parental leave, but also this designated portion for men, for the fathers, because they just weren't seeing the uptake. And you've probably heard this one, but in Quebec now, almost 20 years ago, they followed the Scandinavian model, introduced 5 weeks for men. Prior to that designated portion, they only had about 10% of men taking parental leave. And after introducing that, it's now up to 80%. Scandinavia is still ahead at 90%, but the rest of Canada followed that model about 2 years ago. And already in the first year, they saw an additional 10,000 fathers take up that.
That's amazing, because we're at 12% or something, aren't we?
Sorry?
We're about 12%, I think, at the moment of men taking.
We are 12%. Now, on the positive side, that's a doubling from only a few years ago. And I think that speaks to the change in the attitudes amongst men. And as I say, working with intergenerational men, the millennials are really leading the charge. And whilst, to your point, Rob, men are not used to advocating. And frankly, women have been advocating because in some cases it was life or death advocating, correct? I mean, having the vote, being able to run for office, ensuring that you could go back to work instead of being by law banned from going back to work after having children. So men are not as used to advocating, but I'm seeing a lot of young millennial dads standing up. Now, what it takes is identifying other millennial dads in your organization of like mind. And once there is that network, then it's much easier to talk to your managers and your leaders. But the other piece is around leadership, and it is about CEOs and really educating CEOs on what the benefit is. It's as really shifting the narrative from what's in it for women. And of course, we know what's in it for women. And it's important to keep reiterating that. But if we're going to continue talking about this as a slog and an obligation and a duty, as opposed to, men who actually take parental leave perform better on mental and physical health tests of resilience, that they are actually more loyal to companies that have shared parental leave, that they are more productive at work because they actually have to be more organized, just like women have had to be for decades. So if we focus on that, and that it's a competitive advantage right now, when young fathers are looking at two offers, and it's a tight labor market, and one has parental leave that includes fathers and the other one doesn't, you can be sure that that is a deal breaker for many. And I think finally, it is around acknowledging the obstacles that men face that are different from women's. So as we said earlier, men still largely are the primary breadwinners in Australia, which means that for them to take parental leave, that really dramatically affects the combined income, family income. And when you're paying mortgages that are outrageous with interest rate hikes and everything else, what we need to do is be working with corporations that can afford to provide shared parental leave and encouraging men to take that. But we also have to be advocating to our federal government to say, look, minimum wage is not enough to encourage men to take this, because they can't.
And also that parental leave doesn't include super.
Yep.
So when you're thinking, as what you've both said about the long-term benefits, you got to think about, well, what's in it for people to do it.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And whilst the stigma, which is still worse for men because there were fewer of them, we were not yet Scandinavia with the papa lattes, but that stigma and isolation is real in the sense that we don't have as many daddy support groups. We still have men who are telling us, oh, I went to the mummy support group and I really didn't feel welcome. And, so that's working with mothers too, and helping to shift that. As far as the career progression fears, look, I think we just have to be really honest about that. You were referring to a study, Karina, that came out recently about dads really feeling discriminated against, that they aren't going to necessarily have the same opportunities. But look, it's not just that women have been experiencing that, but we've got to talk to leaders and have them explain to their employees that, look, as Rob says, this is a blip. This in your whole career, like Deloitte years ago came up with this concept of career customization, meaning that there are times in your career when you can really lean in, right? And that's generally before children.
Yeah.
There's times that you might have to lean out, whether it be because you're a parent or you've got a sick parent of your own, whatever it is. There might be some mental health issues. But, as we say, there are times that we have to be acknowledged that these are going on and you just don't have the same capacity. But that's not for a lifetime. That's not for your whole career. It's that blip. It's that short period.
Yeah. And I guess so famously, it's the what they've referred to as the father bonus and then the motherhood penalty. But I know there were reports released in the last couple of weeks that actually talk about the fatherhood penalty for when they're taking on care arrangements. So it seems to be the caring penalty regardless of gender roles, which is really sad because, as you both say, it's a blip.
Yeah.
I'm sure these people, many parents have done the hard yards before they've had kids. And usually, I know in my own case, I worked 3 days a week last year. I've upped that to 4 this year. Yes, it's not full time, but I think 4 days a week me is very optimal. And I'm productive. People, it's also this notion around as well, it doesn't matter how many hours you've done. You could work 60 hours, but as we know, any more than 55, your productivity goes down. So it's also about quality over quantity.
Yeah.
And I know that I was way more productive in 3 days than what I was in 4. I'm just getting paid for the work that I was doing anyway.
Yeah. If I can jump in, Karina, I think that's a great point. And I found the same too. As someone who's working part-time for the last 5 or 6 years, I think the 4 days I work, they're not long days, but they're super productive. You're not wasting many moments. You squeeze every piece of time for what it's worth. And to Colleen's point, when we're talking about, what's in it for men, I think this is a really big piece missing from the caring conversation. As wonderful it is when we're talking about bonding and being with your children, if you take things like extended parental leave or you're an active carer, you bring back to the workforce a bunch of skills that are super valuable in terms of what we're talking about: multitasking, time management, organization, but even things like emotional intelligence and empathy and listening skills, communication skills, everything that we kind of put in a bucket that is required of a good manager in whatever field, really. You bring that back. And, often I think for men, reasonably they're thinking about, what happens if I step out of the workplace? What am I missing out on? But it's actually, what are you gaining at home? And then what are you bringing back to the workforce? And I think all three of us can sort of testament to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is such a good point. I just a quick anecdote, if I can, Karina. I was on a construction site with one of my clients, a young man actually, and we were driving back, and he was talking about the difference in leadership traits. And he said, my leader, the person I report to, one day I just wasn't feeling 100%. And she could see that, she could feel it. And she just said, do you want to talk about it? He said, there's not a man in the firm, with the exception perhaps of some fathers, who would have been able to tap into that. So it's such a good point about what you learn during those parental leaves.
Yeah. And it's one of those things as what we're saying, pretty much that caring bias, but really flipping it on its head. It's about that caring advantage and those caring skills that you bring back in.
Absolutely.
So I saw something recently, and we've all talked about it, like when you're on parental leave, yes, people may think you've got all this time in the world, where really going back to work is pretty much the holiday. Being on leave is actually much harder than being at work, that's for sure. But it's those skills and those attributes that certainly employers should be seeing, that those caring and those periods out of time, those are really critical attributes that should be at the top of the list for a selection criteria than just as the nice to haves, because of, as what you've both said, the skills, the emotional intelligence. As we know, these are things that you can't necessarily go to a training course for. You can't do a management class. You can be aware of it, but then learning it and doing it is completely different. And children force that out of us at times as well. So what can we do, like of about improving some of these gender biases and that? So I've got a small story that this week, it was about 4:45. A colleague called me on Teams and he said, "Oh, I can imagine you right now having 2 kids on either knee." And I was sort of like, this is a bit weird. And I said, "No, they're in childcare." And he goes, "Oh, I bet you have to go pick them up soon." I said, "No, husband's doing that." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And then I said, "No, I'm on dinner duty," because we split it. And he's like, "Oh, okay." But it shut him up straight away, because I pushed back to him. I thought, no, I'm going to overcome your biases and things. What is it that we can do to improve these gender biases and improve the support for both working parents? Is it just calling it out, or I guess advocating as well? But it can also be quite challenging, I know, at times for women, because as we know, we return back into work. And as what you also referred to, Rob, you return back to work, you're thinking, yep, I've got it all in handle, but it can also fall over really quickly because of your confidence and your mindset as well. So what can we do to improve this support and also advocacy?
Coleen, do you want to have first crack?
Sure. Well, first, I think your response to someone who would have grown up at a time when that's exactly what his experience would have been. So speaking to, the things we learned during the formative years. But I think you handled that really well. No, in fact, my husband's picking up. I'm on dinner duty tonight. We share the load, because you're helping to educate someone who, for whom this is quite foreign and quite new. I think it is around having some courageous conversations in situations where someone wouldn't have been ready for that and might have been put off. Now, as long as it wasn't their manager or wasn't done disrespectfully. I mean, it can be your manager as long as it's handled well. But, it is sometimes talking in the eye. When I hear something like that, it makes me think that you don't really understand that my career is important and that's what I'm doing right now. Like, this is work hours. But it takes a certain amount of vulnerability. But people react really well to that. It's not a defensive response. It's I'd really like you to understand how this makes me feel. And it actually encourages a bit of a shift too. It's the mindset shift that we're looking for as well. And it might make him think twice before he would say something like that again. That's an interesting assumption you've just made. Why would you think that? Like, really getting curious. It's an interesting assumption, but my husband and I, like most of our friends, are sharing care and career these days. It's a great experience, right? Building networks of allies at work, as I mentioned before, is really helpful, particularly for men, because this is new, as Rob says. Advocating is new, and actually taking parental leave is new. So that's just a couple of things. Rob?
Yeah, look, and I would build on all that. I think that's all terrific, what Coleen said. I think, courageous conversations I think they need to take place at the home, in families, as well as in the workplace as well, and even in schools. In terms of gender bias, the ones that I'm sort of encountering right now, really around some of the school stuff. So, I'm the primary contact. I did all the school enrollment forms and all that paperwork, and I try and be on top of the school stuff. But if there's ever an issue, Julia is the one that gets called first every time. This is sort of, midway through the second year of schooling, and it just frustrates me to no end that continues to be the case. And there's been a few calls from teachers or principals about Clementine, and still goes to Julia. And even if she's working and whatever, they just leave her voicemails rather than call me. So that's really frustrating. So I think for men in particular, I think it is being sort of very clear and explicit about what your focus in your life is. And it doesn't have to be in an abrasive way, but I think being very clear that, drawing boundaries around work, or when you do have kid or school commitments, just sort of owning it and being proud of it, and basking it in a way. If you do need to leave early to do the childcare pickup, be very clear that that's what's happening. Or if you're going to go to a school concert or go to the reading group, I still know of men who would basically say, I've got a doctor's appointment, I've got to go to the dentist to go and do the school stuff, because it's easier to say that to a boss than actually say they've got to go and do family things. So I think that's partly how we start to sort of shift the mainstream culture, when dads are just talking about it, talking about, what their commitments are, and then also just talking about their experiences, whether it's in the workplace or outside of it. With my manager, we have a catch up every fortnight, and it starts with a well-being check. And that's just, how are you going as a human being? And that is the chance to be about, you can be, things are tough at home. The kids aren't sleeping, or they're sick, or, my daughter's not talking to me, whatever it is. And I think it's that chance to show that it's a big part of your personality as well. Support, I think, is a big one. We've touched on it a couple of times. I think the last workplace I was in, it started when we ended up having a pretty nice little dads group, but it started with just a couple of dads talking in the kitchen one lunch one day. It was completely ad hoc, a bit of a bump in, and one dad seemed tired, and they started trading some more stories. And from then it got to, are you doing any caring? Are you taking any parental leave? And then it got to the next step of, actually, my manager's not approving it. I'm not going to be able to take it. And then more dads came into the conversation, and it went from, a water cooler chat about fatherhood to a bit of support for fathers to also a bit of advocacy for change inside the organization. So I think you can build it up gradually and slowly and organically. So it can be just an informal support network, so you don't feel alone. And then if things aren't right in your workplace, to the points we talked about with parental leave, if it's inadequate, you've then got a group of allies. You can go and start to make the case. And even if that is, an awkward conversation and a courageous conversation, you've got support there. You're not alone. You have solidarity. And I think that's really important. And I guess to dads out there, one of the last points I would just say is, whenever you get an opportunity to sort of throw yourself into caring and fatherhood, just have a bias towards taking it, whether it's coaching your kids' team, rocking up to daycare to read a book, going to the canteen, whatever it is. I think the more you immerse yourself, the better you'll feel. And as we said, there's heaps of benefits for that from your child right through to the workplace. So try and lean in as much as you can. And I guess also realize that you're human. It's okay to be overwhelmed or exhausted, or to drop a few balls, or to feel like you're not doing things great. Give yourself a break, have some self-compassion. I think, the more I go into this, trying to keep a balance in work and life means managing an imbalance just as well as you can. I don't think you'll ever share your load completely, numerically equally with a partner, but you try and find the realistic balance between you. And one week you might do more than your partner might do more the next week, but to give yourself and your partner, a break. Because, I think if you go in with a positive mindset and you're truly committed to it, that's a fantastic start. It'll be hard, but, give yourself a break as well, because it's a pretty tiresome journey at times.
Yeah, it's certainly not meant to be easy. And I guess it's one of those things, this will be fine, I'll be okay. But as we know, no matter if you're a mother or the father, there's no guidebook. We don't know what we're doing. We're doing the best we can at each stage. And I think it's a lot of people will look to the mother of having all the answers, but we don't. It's also about really sharing that load as well. And Coleen, if people are coming up against those challenges about, parental leave, flexible work, and, working the 4-day a week and having those difficult conversations, because we know that not all organizations and not all leaders are advocates, are not yet on this journey. What can we do to, give them those small nudges to help try and have those conversations? Or even what do we do when they are shut down, as what Rob said as one of his colleagues' examples?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'd pick up on where Rob points out, if you start to have these conversations at work and identify those of like mind, and there are so many of them. There are so many young dads out there now, and a lot of young mothers who recognize the importance of dads taking parental leave, that it is, I think the first piece is identifying allies that you can work with and speak to your managers, and ideally speak to, find a way to your leaders if you're not at a higher level in the organization. But I think the other piece is around educating these leaders as well. I think about, I was 216 when Horizon introduced shared parental leave in Australia. And I was working with a network of 10 firms. And I said, look, I can tell you that this is one of the most important things if we want to get to gender equality in Australia quickly. And so we made that a priority. And within a few years, everyone had shared parental leaves, all the large firms. And then it was, okay, it's not just about having the policy in place. What are you going to do to encourage and even celebrate men going off on leave? So what they did was they started gathering stories. So pictures, 1,000 words, and testimonials from these men who were out on leave. And because this was an industry network, here were 10 firms celebrating, publishing, putting in their annual reports, everything. These men out there having just a blast. It wasn't the days that they were having a bad day, of course, just having a blast with their children. And that alone encouraged competitors right away to say, oh my goodness, if we're not on board, we are going to be left behind. And that's only become much more relevant since, the tight labor market and not being able to find people, or the quiet resignation where people are actually leaving unless they can work flexibly and unless they can have the kinds of policies that they're looking for. And I think on that, we've talked about millennial dads, but the other interesting group is the Gen Zs coming up, or Gen Zs. Not sure how we're supposed to say that, but at any rate, this group is not at all interested in working 24/7, as we're aware. And so when you have got an organization where it's, absolutely okay to work remotely, or to work a compressed week, or to work, to job share. And to that point, what we've been starting to showcase is leaders job sharing. So I work with 2 sets of clients. Both of them, the CEOs are job sharing. In one case, it's 2 women and a man, actually 3 people sharing the country lead role. In the other case, it's in the financial industry, and it's 2 men running a bank. I mean, wow. This was not heard of even 5 years ago, right? So if you can showcase that flexible work is fine, parental leave is fantastic, then that certainly will help to increase the proportion and overcome some of these barriers. But I would say find your allies, work together, educate your managers, find a way to reach your leaders and share this kind of data and information.
And it's really, I guess, it's that war for talent and the way that our market is at the moment, that it's also then encouraging these changes. I know also government tenders that are asking for greater diversity. What are you doing for workforce development? That is also good to see these changes taking place, and that are actually forcing organizations, to make these changes, and it's good that it's starting to take place. I know the 3 of us would agree that's probably not happening quick enough, but at least these kind of conversations, and hopefully if you're listening, that you feel empowered that you can actually make these changes, that you can, even as Rob said, it starts off by just a conversation at the water cooler. As the song goes, from little things, big things grow. But it's so true. And that's really how, the tide has changed over literally hundreds of years, and the role of different genders that we have. So looking to the future, where would you both love to see? Like, we could crystal ball it. What would you love to see as how the conversation changes and also the policies then continue to evolve, particularly around improving gender equality?
You start, Rob.
Okay. Well, look, my ultimate aspiration in this space is that the things that we've talked about here today and, sharing the load, family-friendly workplaces, dads being as active as mums, that it becomes completely normal and baked in and uncontroversial and essentially boring. With essentially, it's as part of our community. And the thought of a dad going out advocating for involved fatherhood is just a complete anathema. It doesn't need to happen anymore. That's what I would hope that it gets, is that we've managed to change systems and policies and culture so much that it's assumed that this is the way we go about things now. Kind of like to what Coleen was saying, what's happening in Scandinavia and the latte dads, that it's just part of who we are. That's where I would love to see this ending up, where the role of advocates is essentially redundant from now on. In the short term, look, I really want to see those numbers in terms of dads taking primary care, dads taking extended parental leave, dads working part-time, dad job sharing to start to rise more sharply. And, I think we haven't really even got to the impact of COVID, but, I think it's had a bit of a mixed result, but it has shown, I think, to a range of dads and a range of industries what is actually possible in their lives in terms of balancing in work and family. So I think if what we've talked about here today is starting to make an impact, and as Coleen said, Gen Zs and millennials are really driving this change, we will hopefully see in the next set of census figures and, and ABS data that those numbers are picking up quite sharply. We'll hopefully also see more companies introducing generous parental leave schemes. Coleen is absolutely right. The public government parental leave scheme is still lagging, even with the changes of this year. It's still not the gold standard. That needs to be much higher as well. So I would love to see that, our parental leave schemes are actually, at the top of the OECD and sort of keeping up with Scandinavia and Canada and others. And that we're, for instance, I was at the swimming pool this morning with my son for his swimming lesson, and I just thought, I was mindful we had the podcast coming up, so I did a straw poll of just dads to mums around the pool center. So it was 9:30 on a Friday morning. There was about 4 dads, including myself, watching their kids swim, and there were about 16, 17 mums. Not great, obviously. It's not woeful like it used to be, but still got a ways to go. So I would love to, let's say, when I'm going back to watch them swim in 2 years' time, that's, a much more even split. That would be a sign to me, at least at a grassroots level, that things are moving the right direction.
It's actually probably representative of where we're at society in terms of percentages.
Yeah, I wasn't a bad figure. It's a very, it's only one data set, so it's a bit dodgy, but I thought, yeah, it's about right where we are now. It's certainly better than it was when I started out in this journey, but it's nowhere near where we need to be.
No, definitely.
Yeah. Look, I would just echo Rob's remarks. I would like to see this completely normalized. And there's really only 2 actions I would recommend. And we've talked about it. One is, if you're working in an organization that has or is considering shared parental leave, is that you really do all you can to encourage men and to celebrate men and share their stories. We have had firms that have actually experienced an 800% increase in men who are taking parental leave because that's what the organization is doing. That's the first. So it's, if you don't have it, you just find your allies and really educate everyone about what's the benefit to fathers, mothers, the company, our economy, etc. And the second one, right now, what we're seeing is a bit of a divide, because we have these large corporates that are offering shared parental leave, and you've got small and mid-sized firms, which make up the majority of our companies in Australia, who are really struggling to even offer 2, 3, 4 weeks. So what I'd like to see second is a bit of advocacy towards our federal government to say, look, you've started the reform. It is essential that we are offering this to every father in Australia, and that there is a designated portion, because we are not going to shift our culture if we're only focused on the very small portion of white collar professionals. So write to your MP. I write to mine all the time. Rob and I share an MP. She knows us well. If you want a form letter, we're happy to provide that. This is what we need in terms of parental leave in the country. And it's got to be not 26 weeks by 2026. It's got to be 52 weeks by 2026.
Yeah, here.
And that's at minimum wage. If we follow the UK or Canada, we'd be offering, full pay for 37 weeks with a designated portion, at least in Canada and Scandinavia, for fathers. But happy to help with that advocacy. It's really essential.
Yeah, I think that's definitely really well said. And it's so important that to be able to have the shared leave. I actually heard of a story this week where in COVID in the UK, the father was allowed there for the first 2 hours after the baby was born. And then because of COVID was then told to leave, which really from birth, it's actually setting up the care arrangements for that child, that it's only the mother that's able to care for it in hospital. And it's interesting that view that they had. I was very glad that in Australia, they at least allowed both parents to be there because they saw the importance of it. But it was sad that, that there's those scenarios. But as we were talking earlier, it start from birth or even before birth, these systemic issues and the gender-based norms that we have. And certainly let's hope that these parental leave reforms continue to stay front of mind. It's like the work that, say, Georgie Dent and the Parenthood are doing, the reports that are coming out that keep it front of mind. I know, Rob, you were talking about one in a report last week around, the fatherhood penalty and the impacts and things like that. So these reports are really good to highlight the reforms that are needed and also give a fact-based discussion. It's just not what we know as hearsay, but certainly keeping up that advocacy is so important. So if you are listening, write to your MP, be vocal about it with your employees, because it is that 80% of SME businesses that can actually create those changes. And, it's just like superannuation. They could always put some money into a fund that they need to have, and they'll get it back in their return. They'll get it back in long-term employees and things like that. I know we could actually keep talking forever on this topic. We're three very passionate people around this, but I know that all good things eventually need to come to an end. But I always end every podcast with on what you do for self-care. So I'll start off with you, Coleen. What do you do for self-care?
Sure. I do ocean swimming. That's my happy place. I just meditate, forget about everything, and come up with my best ideas are in the middle of the ocean. So that's what I do.
Fantastic. And how about yourself, Rob?
Similar, although Coleen would leave me for dead in open ocean swimming. I like going to the beach and floundering around. Meditating too, I find, has been super helpful for me the last few years. And going to the movies. I love that experience. I don't care if I'm the only one in the cinema. Something about it I just find so relaxing.
Oh, so good. That's what I missed when it was 2021 and I had my son. I used to love going to the Mums and Bubs movies just so I could just go to the movies, but couldn't do that in 2021. Now, how can people connect with both of you? Coleen, do you want to share how people can connect with you?
Sure. So on LinkedIn, Coleen MacKinnon, Coleen with one L just to be different, and MacKinnon, not Mick, or via my website at inclusivityq.com.au.
And how about yourself, Robin? You can also give a plug for your book.
Oh, yes. So if you're interested and you're risky wanting to hear more from me, you can buy my book, Man Raises Boy, which is all about sort of my journey so far about fatherhood and what I hope to get out of raising a little boy to be a healthy, beautiful, good young man. Available online still, Booktopia and other places. LinkedIn, like Coleen, so Rob Sturrock on LinkedIn, you'll see me there. And then also on Twitter, if you pop in my name, I think it's Rob_Sturrock as the handle, and there'll be a photo of me and hopefully you can spot me out. So yeah, if anyone's got any further questions, I'd love, or experiences, always love hearing from parents and their own experiences. Do feel free to reach out. And thanks for having us here today, Karina.
Yes, thanks so much, Karina.
No, the pleasure's all mine. I have to say, I've followed both of you for quite a while, and I was very excited when Coleen replied back to my LinkedIn message about being on this podcast, and then she invited Rob on as well. So I have to say, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time, your valuable insights. I have to say, this conversation has definitely filled my cup for today. And I really thank you both again. So connect with both Coleen and Rob. And as a key takeaway for this, keep advocating for yourselves and also for your husbands and your partners in this. We all need to work together. It's not a woman's issue to change gender diversity. It's a societal issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Working Mama podcast. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast catcher. Please also feel free to contact me on any of the Working Mama social channels. Remember, Mama is MUMMA, or website www.workingmama.com.au. I would appreciate you to share this podcast with friends and colleagues, especially those that are parents managing the juggle. And I would really appreciate if you had to take the time out to leave a review of the podcast. Thank you, and see you next time. Have a great week.